By late winter of 1944 to 1945, the Pacific War had entered its decisive stage. The Philippines, once an American colony, carried a dual significance, a powerful national symbol and a strategic key, with its ports and airfields vital for the planned assault on Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, who had been forced to leave the Philippines in 1942 after vowing to return, was determined to retake Manila as quickly as possible, both to liberate thousands of prisoners held by the Japanese and to restore the prestige of the Philippine government in exile. Yet within the American command, disagreements arose. General Walter Kruger, commander of the 6th Army, favored a cautious approach, consolidating forces at Lingayen Gulf before advancing on Luzon, fearing that Japanese units in the mountains might strike their rear. MacArthur, however, insisted that delay would only give the enemy time to destroy Manila and execute prisoners. He ordered an immediate advance, hoping the Japanese would declare the city open, as the Americans themselves had done in 1942. On the Japanese side, strategy was equally divided. General Tomoyuki Yamashita recognized that defending Manila would be suicidal, and intended instead to withdraw into the northern mountains to wage a guerrilla war. His orders required General Shizuo Yokoyama, commander of the Shimbu Group, to evacuate Manila and place all naval forces in the area under his command. But Vice Admiral Denshichi Okochi countermanded this by instructing Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commander of the Manila Naval Defense Force, to hold the city at all costs, both to protect naval installations and to avenge the humiliation of losing the battleship Kirishima at Guadalcanal. Loyal to his naval superiors rather than Yamashita, Iwabuchi gathered some 17,000 men, including sailors from sunken ships, Marines, mechanics, Korean and Taiwanese auxiliaries, and even civilian workers, then resolved to fight to the death. Ill-equipped, his force lacked tanks, heavy artillery, and standard infantry weapons. They improvised by stripping 990 20mm machine guns from aircraft, deploying 600 other machine guns, a handful of 120mm guns, and turning naval bombs into mines. Many men armed with nothing more than spears fashioned from bayonets lashed to poles. Against this backdrop, on January 31st, 1945, MacArthur personally arrived at the 1st Cavalry Division's command post at Lingayen to order an immediate advance. Just 1 minute past midnight on February 1st, the flying columns, fully motorized cavalry detachments, set off, covering more than 100 miles of jungle and mountain in just 66 hours to reach the outskirts of Manila. On February 4th, the 37th Infantry Division also began its march. Within days, the iron horses of the 1st Cavalry were pressing into the city's outer districts. MacArthur gave them 3 urgent objectives: to rescue internees at Santo Tomas University, to seize Malacañang Palace, and to capture the legislative building. On the night of February 3rd, troops of the 8th Cavalry Regiment forced open the gates of Santo Tomas University. The guards on duty, mostly Taiwanese, offered almost no resistance. Around 3,500 prisoners, mostly Americans, British, and Dutch, who had been interned since 1942, burst into tears of relief, embracing their liberators. Yet 63 Japanese soldiers still held 275 hostages inside the main school building. Negotiations dragged on until February 5th before they were finally freed. Immediately afterward, the Americans faced the urgent task of providing food for thousands of newly liberated internees. At the same time, the Japanese blew up the Novaliches Bridge, cutting off supply routes and leaving the 1st Cavalry Division short of rations and ammunition, forcing the 37th Infantry Division to carve out a relief corridor. Meanwhile, units of the 37th Division advanced through the Tondo district in the north, reaching the old Bilibid prison where they discovered 1,330 prisoners, American POWs and civilians, abandoned by the Japanese. As fire spread and fighting raged, the Americans were forced to evacuate the captives by any available means, only to bring them back once the flames subsided. Along the narrow streets, Japanese troops had buried mines, strung barbed wire, blocked roads with trucks, and set up interlocking machine gun positions. When the 148th Regiment crossed the Estero de la Reina Bridge toward the Pasig River, they ran into mines and 500-pound bombs rigged on the bridge, while fuel depots erupted in flames and machine gun fire poured down on them. The Noguchi detachment of the Japanese torched numerous riverside buildings and planted explosives in military facilities, forcing the Americans to pull back temporarily to fight the fires. In the midst of liberation, Manila's civilians flooded the streets to shower gifts and praises on the Americans, though some also looted, creating chaos that at times hampered military operations. By February 7th, U.S. forces had secured nearly all of Manila north of the Pasig. The surviving Japanese withdrew to the southern bank, demolishing all 6 bridges across the river. Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold, commander of the 14th Corps, ordered the 37th Division to expand eastward, while the 1st Cavalry Division swung around to the east and south to encircle the city. That same day, the 148th and 129th Regiments of the 37th began crossing the river in engineer boats and amphibious vehicles. The first wave got across without incident, but the second came under heavy machine gun fire from the south bank. Oars were shattered, and many soldiers had to paddle with their rifle butts or bare hands to reach the shore. They landed at the Malacañang Gardens, the only stretch without high embankments, and established a bridgehead. The following day, engineers built a 2-lane pontoon bridge, but it was immediately overrun by hundreds of civilians fleeing the fighting, causing severe congestion. When the 37th Division finally crossed the river, they faced the dense industrial and residential blocks south of the Pasig, where the Japanese had transformed sturdy buildings into fortresses. On Provisor Island, the steam power plant loomed like a block of steel and stone, now turned into a citadel with sandbag bunkers and machine gun nests. American troops had to row through a hail of bullets, storming dark, smoke-filled rooms, fighting hand-to-hand amid the roar of generators. It took them 2 bloody days and 25 dead comrades before the plant was secured. Pressing on, the 148th Regiment swept through Pandacan with little resistance, but at Paco railway station they were stopped cold. Tracks, platforms, and walls had been turned into a deadly maze. 20-millimeter guns at every corner, reinforced concrete bunkers, slit trenches, and even the church bell tower used as an observation post. American infantry had to crawl yard by yard, fire bazookas through the walls, and charge under cover of fire. After 10 assaults and clouds of dust and smoke, Paco Station finally fell at 8:45 a.m. on February 10th. The cost was severe: 45 men killed and 307 wounded in just 2 days. From then on, the battle became a grim grind against urban strongpoints. Individual blocks turned into mutually supporting fortresses. At first, artillery fire was restricted by MacArthur's order to preserve the city, allowed only against observed targets. But as casualties mounted, the ban was lifted on February 10th. Thereafter, barrages of 105mm and 155mm guns, supported by tanks and flamethrowers, smashed walls before the infantry stormed in. Often they were repelled, only to call down more artillery and attack again. At the new police station on Marqués de Camilla Street, the Japanese had fortified an entire complex, police headquarters, shoe factory, club, and school, into one massive bastion. It took 8 days of brutal fighting, fresh regiments, tanks charging head-on, and the use of flamethrowers, phosphorus grenades, and artillery shells to clear room after room. While the 37th fought building to building, the 1st Cavalry Division swung wide, carrying out a full encirclement in the manner of a medieval siege. On February 8th, the 8th and 5th Cavalry Regiments crossed the river east and south of the city. The 8th took the shorter route. The 5th looped wide through Makati. They met scattered fire but captured the Makati power station on February 10th, in line with Kruger's policy of preserving infrastructure. By February 12th, both regiments had reached the coast, sealing the ring, then turned north along the bay to link up with the 37th. Along the way, they encountered strong points in Harrison Park, Rizal Stadium, and LaSalle University. The Japanese had dug bunkers into the baseball field, forcing the Americans to flush them out with flamethrowers, explosives, and tanks. On February 16th, the 1st Cavalry Brigade, made up of the 5th and 12th Regiments, was detached from the division to reinforce the 37th in the downtown battles. They advanced on the Manila Hotel and the High Commissioner's residence, MacArthur's former home, fighting room by room, while MacArthur himself appeared in the rubble to encourage his men. In the north, the 37th Division had already cleared most resistance. On February 19th, the exhausted 148th Regiment was relieved by the 5th Cavalry, which pushed into the University of the Philippines Hospital. The Japanese had turned the facility into a death trap with bunkers, loopholes in basements and rooftops, and interlocking fire. After days of combat, only 75 of the 250 defenders remained, and they committed suicide on the night of February 23rd. Over 7,000 patients and civilians trapped inside were rescued. With the outer ring sealed, the Japanese retreated into Intramuros, the old Spanish walled city, its 40-foot thick stone ramparts rising like a fortress. From February 17th, American heavy guns pounded it without pause. By the morning of February 23rd, more than 7,400 shells from 105 millimeters, 155 millimeters, 75 millimeters, 4.2-inch mortars, and even 8-inch guns had blasted a gap in the wall. 10 minutes after the barrage ceased, a smoke screen was laid. The 129th Regiment crossed the Pasig in engineer boats to attack from the north, while the 145th breached the eastern walls. With many machine gun nests already destroyed, progress was swift, until waves of refugees surged into the streets. More than 2,000 women and children, herded by the Japanese into the Delmonico Church, had not yet been evacuated. Supply troops rushed trucks to carry them to safety. The men, however, were separated and marched into Fort Santiago, where they were executed en masse. Inside the walled city of Intramuros, the 129th and 145th Regiments advanced street by street, each narrow lane turned into a gauntlet of dugouts and traps. In the northwest corner stood Fort Santiago, once the prison of national hero José Rizal under Spanish rule, now transformed into a dark labyrinth of cells and tunnels. American troops had to pour gasoline and oil through vents, toss in phosphorus grenades, and sweep with flamethrowers to root out the defenders. Flames licked the mossy stone walls as smoke thickened the air. After clearing cell blocks and underground passages, they reported the fort secured by midday, February 25th. Some Japanese disguised themselves in U.S. uniforms with M1 rifles. Others raised white flags from Delmonico's bell tower only to fire again. None survived. Only 25 Taiwanese troops surrendered. At dawn on February 26th, with the fortress lost, Rear Admiral Iwabuchi and his staff committed suicide inside the agriculture building. Though Intramuros had fallen, 3 massive concrete buildings remained: the Legislative Building, the Finance Building, and the Agriculture Building, now the final bastions of Japanese resistance. Anticipating a southern assault, Iwabuchi had heavily reinforced them: machine guns at every window, sandbagged basements, and fortified bunkers. On February 25th, the 37th Division's artillery unleashed a barrage, but some rounds overshot and fell among the 1st Cavalry Division near the bay, forcing a pause for adjustment. On February 26th, the 148th Regiment stormed the legislative building, but Japanese defenders hurled grenades through holes in the floors, forcing the infantry to withdraw for more bombardment. It was not until February 28th that the structure was finally taken. Meanwhile, the 5th Cavalry assaulted the agriculture building, but was pinned down by fire from the nearby San Luis Terrace apartments, and had to clear that strong point before returning. On February 28th, 155mm guns fired point blank, while American tanks ground against the base of the agriculture building, smashing the lower levels. Flamethrowers, bazookas, and phosphorus grenades burned out the gun nests. On March 1st, the Americans called for surrender, but silence was the only answer. They responded with more fire, fuel and explosives collapsing the structure piece by piece. 2 days later, after another artillery barrage, the 148th Regiment stormed the finance building and wiped out the last Japanese holdouts in the elevator shaft by dawn on March 3rd. That afternoon, General Griswold signaled Kruger, "All resistance has ended." The Battle of Manila was over. Yet the true horror of those 3 weeks was not only in the gunfire. As the fighting raged, Japanese naval troops, undisciplined and desperate, turned their fury on civilians. Districts like Tondo, Binondo, and Paco were put to the torch. Women and children were herded into churches and schools, then burned or blown apart with grenades. Men were slaughtered in backyards and garbage pits. Survivor diaries tell of hundreds burned alive in theaters, in Bayview's cathedral, and at St. Paul's School. Families crawled into sewers, pushing children through narrow cracks to survive. At the Quirino family home, Japanese soldiers murdered the wife and children of politician Manuel Roxas, leaving him to scream helplessly. Witness Lourdes Reyes recalled civilians dragged to the river, their throats cut, bodies pushed into the current. Others hiding in the Bayview Hotel were gang raped, and as American artillery widened its bombardment, civilians trapped in air raid shelters were crushed or burned alive. Afterward, U.S. estimates concluded that most civilian deaths came from Japanese massacres, but they also acknowledged their own artillery had inflicted heavy losses. By March 3, 1945, Manila had become nothing more than a shattered city. 3 weeks of fighting cost the Americans 1,010 dead and 5,565 wounded. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated, with 16,665 killed. But the heaviest toll was borne by the civilians. 100,000 lives lost, making Manila one of the worst tragedies of the Second World War. The American artillery that shielded their soldiers also reduced the ancient district of Intramuros to rubble. Water, electricity, and transport systems were ruined. Hospitals, schools, universities, and neighborhoods lay in ruins. After the battle, U.S. forces had to shift from combat to administration, rebuilding temporary bridges, clearing mines, and posting guards to stop looting. Soldiers, though treated to films, dances, and hot meals, still faced the grim reality of a city scarred by disease, destruction, and haunting memories. Militarily, the battle revealed the power of combined arms warfare. Even without air power inside the city, the Americans had ample artillery, tanks, flamethrowers, and excellent coordination. Once restrictions on artillery fire were lifted, they learned to level each block before advancing, which steadily reduced their casualties, from an average of 26 deaths per day in the opening phase to just 6 by the end of February. The Japanese, by contrast, lacked artillery, tanks, communications, and air support. All they had left was sheer willpower and the city itself. Foxholes dug into streets, mines laid in stairwells, machine guns firing from windows, and a determination to fight to the last room. But such tenacity could not withstand overwhelming firepower and encirclement. The Battle of Manila marked the first and only time in the Pacific War that U.S. forces had to storm a major city. Its liberation paved the way for the recapture of Luzon, but also exposed the brutal cost of urban warfare on civilians. In such a fight, every house can become a fortress, and every family can be a victim. The firestorm of Manila in 1945 consumed not only its historic walls, but also the memory of an entire generation's darkest hour, a warning to posterity of the unparalleled devastation that comes when war enters the city, and a reminder that peace and life must be cherished at all costs.